So today we're going to talk about two art movements, Art Nouveau and Symbolism. Now, while the Impressionists were a somewhat organized group, and the Post-Impressionists were considerably less so, we're going to find in some ways even less organization, particularly when we talk about symbolism. But these are both artistic movements that really hit their stride in the last decade of the 19th century, so in the 1890s. And then we'll see what happens in our next unit as we move towards the beginning years of the 20th century. Now, the first period we're going to consider is Art Nouveau, which literally means new art. This was an international movement. In Germany, they called it the Jugendstil or the youth style. It was really a movement that called for the unification of different forms of art. And so art, things like architecture, sculpture, and painting, and things that were generally considered craft, various kinds of metalworking and glassworking and furniture, were all supposed to be unified together. In that sense, it's similar to what was called the arts and crafts movement in England, but whereas the arts and craft movement really favored things like old-fashioned materials and a very handmade quality to it, um, Art Nouveau, because it is this new style, made the use of new materials and new technology for sort of machine-made objects. So, a key characteristic that we see in this movement is linear design, a very dynamic pattern. And here you can see these curvilinear forms in both these examples that I'm showing you. So it is a style that can tend towards the abstract, but there was still this idea that the forms sort of relate to things that were found in nature. So things like plant form and things in sort of microscopic forms that were now being discovered as science progressed in the 19th century as well. They took their influence from the past, like a lot of other periods that we talked about. But in this case, they were looking not to the more traditional past, like looking towards, for example, classical antiquity or looking towards the Renaissance, which was very common. Instead, they were looking towards different periods, things like the Rococo, the sort of French aristocratic style, which you can see represented in the architecture here. They were influenced by things like Celtic and Anglo-Saxon jewelry and enamel work, and we're going to see the continued interest in Japanese print. Now, the first print that I want to look at with you is Moulin Rouge, La Goulue, which was really Henri's first major sort of foray into printmaking. It was a large scale poster and it made him literally famous overnight. This was his first real print. And it stood out when it was hung around Paris, not only for its size, but because most of the prints at that time were text dominated. And this had this very striking image on it as well. About 3,000 copies of this print were made to celebrate the Moulin Rouge, which was a fairly still new dance hall. It was only built in '89, and it had become a real symbol of the city, of sort of Paris as being glittery and exciting and flashy. The subject of the work is La Goulou, which was a dancer. That was her nickname. Her nickname literally means the glutton, and she was a can-can dancer. And Lautrec painted and drew her more than a dozen times. And that was very characteristic of Lautrec, is that he really did use as his subject the people that were part of his world, people that he knew both from members of his family and the aristocracy, but also the prostitutes and the dancers and the circus performers that he hung around in Montmartre. So, in a sense, a lot of Toulouse-Lautrec's pictures are quite autobiographical. So this was Goulou, the glutton, who I think normally had quite reddish hair, but you could see in the photograph of her, she has this sort of top knot on her hair, on her head, and she had sort of very voluptuous proportions, and hence the name the glutton, because apparently she danced, drank, and ate all to excess. And we see her along with her partner, who is called Valentin the Boneless. And that's the man you see in the photograph, but also he's represented by the gray silhouette you see in the front of the print. Now I'm saying that the work is a print, so we should talk a little bit more about what that means, because this is very specifically a kind of print known as a lithograph. So this is done by a process known as lithography. Normally, when we talk about printmaking, we describe printmaking as either being a relief technique, where the lines that are meant to be printed are sort of raised on your original block, or an intaglio technique where the lines that are going to be printed are carved into a block. Lithography is what we call a planimetric technique, meaning that the surface of the block remains unchanged. It's really a late 18th century invention, basically that works on the principle of the fact that oil and water repel each other. So basically, it's called lithography, and lithos is stone in Greek. So a very smooth, polished stone slab, like granite, something sort of very smooth and non-porous, is drawn on with a grease crayon. And though there's more to the process than this, the block, once it's drawn on with grease crayon, the block can be wet down. And as it's wet down, it wets the block, but not the areas where the grease crayon has been applied, because again, oil and water repel each other. And then an ink is rolled onto the surface, which doesn't adhere to the wet block, but does adhere to the grease crayon. And then paper can be pressed across the surface and either scraped down or run through a press. So this was an old technique, but one that had become more and more important in Paris at the time. And that's largely due, again, to this idea of industrialization. So there were breakthroughs in color lithography, which allowed for these enormous presses to print out these large-scale posters in large numbers. So Toulouse-Lautrec's print here is quite large, and in fact, it had to be made in 3 separate parts. Prints, by the way, in the 1880s and 1890s also became highly collectible as art objects. So some of these were commercial posters meant to be hung, others were sold to collectors. And just in terms of making it understandable what they would cost, the basic idea is that, although it's hard to always tell how much things cost in the past because of changes in things like currency, basically if you could afford a pretty fancy night out in Paris in the clubs, you could afford to buy a print. So these were totally collectible at the time. Other than that, this is a multicolored print, and that's sort of interesting because Toulouse-Lautrec was very influenced by Japanese prints in his time, and I'll show you that when we look at his next print. He collected Japanese prints, and again, we talked about the fact that they became increasingly widespread and popular for artists in the 19th century. This is not anywhere near the size of a Japanese print, but it's interesting that La Goulou is actually the proportions of a Japanese print. And Japanese prints were these nishikie prints, and they were multicolored woodblock prints. So the Japanese had perfected the art of printing in multiple colors. And that's what these images were too. These are multiple color lithographs. So Toulouse-Lautrec's print has 4 separate colors in it, which meant that he had to have 4 separate lithographic stones that each had to be sort of set up so that you could put the print in the same place each time as you ran it through the print to make each individual color. Now in the print, we see La Goulou in the midst of her dance that she was famous for, which was really a more risque version of a can-can called the chaou. And here you could see her kicking up her leg. You could see the outline of her dancer's bloomers, although quite famously, La Goulou didn't really always wear those. You can see his style, which was really quite revolutionary. It was really focused on a lot of simplification, reducing everything to this very simple sort of outline drawing done in black, and then infilling the areas in most cases with unmodulated areas of bright color. So in other words, this has again that idea of Japanese style, the very forced perspective, the emphasis on linear pattern, the lack of modeling that we see in the colors. So it's as if he eliminates all of the detail and reduces everything to its essentials. So we could see the picture sort of in 3 stages. We could see the half silhouetted form of Valentine the Boneless in the front, and then the fully silhouetted sort of semicircle of spectators in the background. And the way the scene is placed, it's supposed to make us feel as if we are a part of the scene watching the dance. The areas that are brightest, though, are in that sort of middle distance, both on the figure of La Goulou, but also in those yellow orbs that are hung throughout, which are probably meant to be the lights in the dance hall, which again make this something of spectacle. You can see the different colors here as well. When I say they're unmodulated, it means you don't see light and shade on any of the forms. These are just flat areas of color, which again creates a very two-dimensional image. And that two-dimensionality is also reinforced by the use of text. And you could see the way Toulouse-Lautrec actually runs the text over the form to sort of integrate the two. Other than that, he does use some areas where we can see what are called spatters, where there's a little bit of variation in the color, particularly in the background and on the floor plane. But other than that, it's all meant to be like strikingly graphic and simplified. And it was, as I said, really revolutionary. And Toulouse-Lautrec found himself very quickly with a name for himself and with more and more of these posters in demand. Now I'll show you one more of these prints, still a large scale print, but slightly smaller, which is the Jane Avril at the Jardin de Paris. Basically, the Jardin de Paris is where people went after the Moulin Rouge closed. The Moulin Rouge would close around 11 o'clock at night, and people would make their way to this next hotspot, which was outside. It was an open air dance hall where people could spend much of the night. And the dancer, Jane Avril, was a lifelong friend of Toulouse-Lautrec. He made quite a few pictures of her, and in this case, she commissioned him to make this poster to advertise a cabaret show that she was doing. And she too, by the way, was famous for that sort of can-can kick. She wrote about Toulouse-Lautrec in her memoirs, and she said, "It is undoubtedly to him that I owe the celebrity I have enjoyed, which dates from the appearance of his first poster of mine." Now, just in terms of talking about style for a second, Toulouse-Lautrec, though he was himself an eccentric and interesting character, he did have relationships with some of the other artists we've studied. By the way, he had a friendship with Vincent van Gogh, though Van Gogh was about 10 years older than he was, and they corresponded, and they were friends. In fact, Toulouse-Lautrec makes a wonderful charcoal drawing of Van Gogh. But he also had a friendship with Degas. Although it's said that the two men sort of drifted apart at a certain point because stylistically they diverged from each other, but it is interesting to see what Toulouse-Lautrec seems to get from Degas. First of all, they share common subjects, which is this idea of performance, although Degas, remains in this aristocratic world of ballet. At least on the surface, we talked about the seedier side of ballet. But Toulouse-Lautrec is always doing these dance halls. But you can see if you look at Degas' rehearsal of the ballet on stage, both artists here have used this very striking and similar device of the musical instruments, this bass, popping up in the foreground, radically cropped without any context of where this is in space. And we can see a very similar motif being used here by Toulouse-Lautrec. In reality, the inspiration for both really goes back to looking at, as we said, Japanese prints. And the Japanese references in Jane of Reel are notable. I just put up an example of a Hiroshige print for you called Maple Trees at Mama, and this was one of the 100 Views of Edo set that we'd seen a print from already. But when you look at the foreground of Hiroshige's print, you could see the way that the foreground is framed by this abruptly up close image of the maple tree, the sort of fork in the tree. And that's very similar to what Toulouse-Lautrec is doing by framing the scene in the distance in this up close detail stemming from the musical instrument. Just as a note, by this point, Toulouse-Lautrec, as you could see here in the bottom left-hand corner of his print, had changed his signature into a sort of monogram, which has very Japanese kind of characteristics to it. It's the integrated T and the L and the H, but you can also see it looks sort of like a Japanese style seal. And there are other Japanese elements here as well. In this case, the very skewed, flattened perspective, again, the presence of text over the image, and those broad, flat areas of unmodulated color, which are quite striking in here. You could see this was another print that was printed in multiple colors. There are 4 separate colors they had to run, so there were 4 separate lithographic stones that were needed for the print. You could also see the way, as she performs her can-can move, the way that her foot in this silhouetted black is meant to sort of pick up echoes in the upright form of the base, which sort of resembles her foot. And so, again, we're forced to see things in the distance and up close on the same plane, which calls attention to the sort of wonderful flatness of the form. So Toulouse-Lautrec is not an artist I'm going to spend a lot of time on, but I wanted to introduce at least this idea of his printmaking as an element of French Art Nouveau. So now we'll just talk briefly about a group of artists associated with Art Nouveau, but outside of France. In fact, in Austria, in Vienna, and it's a group called the Vienna Secession. They were founded in 1897 by a group of artists, including architects and designers. So like Art Nouveau, or really we can consider this a part of Art Nouveau, they are bringing in artists from different disciplines. And this group were sort of dissatisfied with the sort of traditional art institution, which was the Association of Austrian Artists, which was sort of very conservative. And so this group secedes and forms the Union of Austrian Artists, which then comes to be known as the Vienna Secession. So like a lot of groups, like we talked about the Impressionists, they begin to exhibit their work independently of sort of the state establishment. And in 1898, they held their first and their second exhibition, and from this they raised enough funds to commission a building for themselves, which you can see here, the Secession Building, which gave themselves a built-in exhibition space. You could see their inscription, which was their motto, right over the door, and it looks sort of like a temple, and their motto was, "To the age, it's art. To the art, it's freedom." They also, like a lot of artist groups we're going to be talking about, formed their own journal, which was called the Versacrum, which is the sacred spring. And here you can see a description of their sort of ideas. And they said, our art is not a combat of modern artists against those of the past, but the promotion of the arts against the peddlers who pose as artists and who have a commercial interest in not letting art bloom. The choice between commerce and art is the issue at stake in our secession. It is not a debate over aesthetics, but a confrontation between two different spiritual states. So it's very interesting. They had this idea of making art sort of common property, and yet this was a group of artists who still had wealthy patrons. So there's a conundrum here. The secession was eventually abandoned, so it's dismantles in 1905, but we're going to take a look at its most famous artist. Now, the Austrian painter Gustav Klimt is the one that we most associate with this pure Art Nouveau style. Now, unlike someone like Toulouse-Lautrec, he came from a much poorer family and a poor background. His father, which is very interesting to keep in mind, was a goldsmith and a gold engraver. When he was 14 years old, he got a grant to go study at the Vienna School of Art, where he studied first architectural painting. Most of his attention at this point, or attention on him, is given towards him as a person who he was apparently quite eccentric, but he spoke very little about his personal life, saying that he was anything you wanted to know about him, you could learn by looking at his art. And now if that is the case, then maybe he deserves the reputation he has as a notorious womanizer, given his predilection for painting the human figure, particularly the female nude. And many of his paintings are quite erotic, and we'll look at that more. On a personal note, he never married, but he is said to have fathered at least 14 children, and you can see a picture of him here. He used to paint in these huge caftan kind of robes with nothing on underneath, and he had a workshop that was filled with cats, which he loved, and this is his sort of favorite cat, which was Katza. You can see the photograph from 1912. We'll start by looking at one of Klimt's earlier works, which actually caused quite a bit of scandal. So in 1893, Klimt, along with another artist with whom he was longtime friends, were commissioned by Austria's Ministry of Culture to decorate what was called the Great Hall of the University of Vienna. And it was the hall that was used for things like graduations. Now, the idea behind these paintings was pretty traditional. The subjects of the pictures were supposed to represent the major sort of fields of study at the university. They were called the faculty paintings. So for looking back into history, we could go back to the Italian Renaissance, when Raphael, the famous painter of the High Renaissance, painted the Pope's library in the Vatican, which was called the Stanza della Segnatura. And the Stanza della Segnatura was a very similar kind of idea. The library was painted with 4 major themes from human learning. And in that case, they were poetry and theology and philosophy and justice or jurisprudence. So I'm putting up here a picture of Raphael's philosophy painting, which was called the School of Athens, just to show you what we imagine the University of Vienna expected out of these pictures. They were supposed to show the triumph of reason and thought, picturing ideas of, people, great old philosophers standing around talking. So this was the model for the picture. Now, what Klimt and Mech produced was quite a bit different. There was a central panel on the ceiling, which was supposed to be a subject of, the triumph of light over darkness, so all about education. And other than that, the 4 subjects were very similar to Raphael's, except that the subject of poetry got swapped out for medicine, which actually made a lot of sense because at this point in time, Vienna was sort of leading the world in medical research. Now, you might notice in particular that Klimt's pictures look a little old, little like they're in sepia tone compared to the rest, and that is because we no longer have Klimt's pictures, which is one of the great tragedies. Once Klimt began to exhibit his paintings and his plans for the paintings, which was already after he had become part of the secession movement, they were met with quite a bit of outrage on the part of some people, including his patrons. He was accused of pornography. A public prosecutor was actually brought in, and the issue really went all the way up to the Austrian parliament, although there were no action taken against Klimt, except in 1901 when he was elected to a professorship at the academy, and the government refused to ratify his position, probably in punishment for this. But eventually, by about 1904, Klimt ended up resigning from the commission altogether. He repaid his advance and he demanded his pictures back. And at this point, he said, "I've had enough of censorship. I reject all state support. I don't want any of it." The pictures were eventually sold off to private collectors, but in the 1930s they were seized by the Nazis and they were put into a palace to sort of protect them. But unfortunately, in the very ending days of World War II, the castle that they were in was burned down by retreating SS forces. And so we believe, though apparently there's no proof, that Klimt's 3 pictures that he made for this project were lost. The first of the paintings for this project that Klimt actually exhibits was philosophy, which he showed at the 1900s World's Fair, and he actually won a gold medal for it, although again, as we see, it was not without controversy. Just as a note, we, as I said, assume that what the faculty expected was something like Raphael's School of Athens, these ancient robed philosophers. But 1900 was also the same year that Sigmund Freud published his text on the interpretation of dreams. And so it's entirely possible that Klimt's picture was really evoking sort of more modern ideas about philosophy. But again, this shocked people, mostly because it's about philosophy, which is based on this idea of rational thought. And what he presented was something that seemed terribly confusing. And so the academics accused him of sort of displaying these unclear forms. You could see the subject is primarily this sort of enigmatic large column of nude bodies placed against this deep limitless space, and you could see in the background emerging from it this head of a sphinx. And there are people from all different times in life, and then the only sort of conscious head, maybe the one that looks out at the viewer, is this figure draped in a dark cloth at the bottom, which is usually referred to as Wissen or knowledge. So she's sort of the personification of the scene that we see above. Even more spectacular is Klimt's image of medicine, which he showed the year after. In 1901, he presented this at the 10th exhibition of the Secession Group. And it has quite a lot in common with philosophy in that the primary composition is a column of nude bodies, figures from all ages of life, with then a personification down at the bottom. And here the iconography, or the symbolism, is a little bit interesting to read. And by the way, I'm showing you what is the only photograph taken before its destruction, the big black and white one, and a detail that survives in color of the central figure. So what we see is a figure of a nude woman sort of leaning back all the way on the left-hand side, which is usually identified as life. And below her in this sort of womb-like gauzy pile is a newborn child. On the other side, we can see amidst this column of figures, the figure of death, or the skeleton in the center. And you could see that the two groups, the group associated around death and the one of life, are connected only by her outstretched arm and then by the arm of the male nude figure we see from the back. Then down at the bottom, just like we saw in philosophy, there is this one personification, this figure that looks out at the viewer. And she is the Greek goddess Hygeia, which is the Greek goddess of health. And you could see she's got wrapped around her arm. And again, these curvilinear forms we associate with Art Nouveau. This snake, which is associated with the Greek god Asclepius, who was the Greek god of medicine. And then in her hand, she holds a cup, which has in it Lethe, which is a spirit associated with oblivion and forgetfulness. Once again, we can see why this was shocking to the faculty who thought that their picture was supposed to be about prevention and cure and the art of healing and science. And instead, Klimt presents something which is really about life and death and this figure that more or less turns her back on all of it. But now I want to show you two of Klimt's most famous and notorious pictures, which were both from what we call his gold period or his golden period, which I think you can see why. And you could see by the medium here that this is made out of oil on canvas, so traditional oil paint, as well as actual silver and gold. And remember that his father worked with gold as a goldsmith and gold engraver. So this was something that Klimt apparently had sort of a predilection for and some knowledge of. Now, the thing is, a lot of Klimt's pictures were very openly erotic, and that probably didn't appeal to all of his patrons. So Klimt made most of his money supporting himself as a portrait painter. And this is no doubt his most famous portrait, and for many reasons. I'll explain some of that to you. And this is the portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer. She came from a wealthy Jewish family in Vienna. Her father directed a bank and a railroad, and she married a man named Ferdinand Bloch, who was a banker, and he worked like in manufacturing, sugar manufacturing or something like that. So the couple took the hyphenated name Bloch-Bauer. She was very sort of important in Viennese social circles, and she would hold these salons, which were gatherings of intellectuals and artists and other creative types at her home. And she appears to have met Klimt in the 1890s. But it's not until 1903 when Ferdinand, her husband, commissions Klimt to paint a portrait of his wife, which he had intended to give to her parents as an anniversary gift. The picture takes several years. Klimt made hundreds of sketches of her, but also very interestingly, and I said that this picture was commissioned in 1903. In 1903, Klimt took a trip. And he went to the Italian city of Ravenna. Supposedly, he went on a pilgrimage to see the tomb of Dante, the famous medieval Italian poet who was one of Klimt's favorite authors. But while he was there, he came across the beautiful Byzantine frescoes that are all over the churches in Ravenna from the 6th century and later. This one in particular is a wonderful comparison, and it's an image of the Byzantine Empress Theodora in the Church of San Vitale. And Klimt was obviously struck by this image. Now, again, remember the Art Nouveau and Secession artists were very interested in the mixing of the arts, in arts and craft. And so mosaic was something that would have been very appealing to Klimt. And you see that he takes from this Byzantine art not only the interest in mosaic, and not that Klimt's work is mosaic, but you can see that if you look at her dress, it appears almost like it's made out of separate geometric tiles all fitted together, but also gets this interest in the use of gold ground, which was something that was used in Byzantine churches to get this wonderful mystical effect by candlelight. And then that becomes something that Klimt really starts to embrace. And of course, the gold works in other ways. I mean, gold was not only obviously a valuable material, and this is actual like gold and silver leaf sort of affixed to the paint surface, but it's also a symbol in ancient times. The color yellow was associated with regeneration and rebirth, so it had power like the regenerative power of the sun. But gold has also traditionally been used to show power, both earthly power, as in for kings and queens, but also for sort of heavenly divine power. So I'm showing you an example of a 14th century gilded or gold ground altarpiece. So this almost gave this, in a sense, the power of the divine. Not to mention, we can think of the fact that in most works of art, at least modern works of art, the only gold that was part of the picture was the idea of a gilt frame, which was meant to separate the artwork from what was inside to announce its importance. Here, of course, that gold has encroached upon the picture and encroached upon the figure of Adele Bloch-Bauer. So you could see there's this wonderful tension in the work, the shock between the strikingly realistic face, this very pronounced realism of her face and her hands, which look at least somewhat three-dimensional, against all of this gold geometric form, which is strikingly flattening. You could see it, by the way, it's a portrait of Adele seated in an armchair. So she's wearing this gold dress with geometric forms on it, which are, you can see all the eyes and the triangles on her garment. And it looks almost like she's got like peacock feathers sort of merging out from them. And some of those forms come from other cultures, from things like Egyptian art. And then you could see the spirals decorating the armchair that she's seated on, and that sort of speckled pattern which creates the wallpaper behind. So he treats all the surfaces very different, and then it's just punctuated by little bits of red and green. So it's this wonderful tension between the three-dimensional and the flat, makes her look like she's sort of looking behind, almost like a curtain of shattered glass on the surface. Only about 12% of it is really the surface that was painted in the more traditional medium of oil. Now, this is also a picture that's very interesting when we consider its history after Klimt and even after Adele Bloch-Bauer. So Adele had stated in her will that when she died, she wanted her Klimt paintings, of which she had several, including another portrait. She wanted those paintings to go to the Austrian state. Now, she predeceased Ferdinand, her husband, and Ferdinand in 1938 was forced to flee from the Nazis. He moved all over Europe before he ended up in Switzerland, but he ended up leaving a lot of his property behind, and the Nazis seized his entire art collection, which included the Klimts for Adele. And the painting was eventually sold off by the Nazis, and it ended up in the Gallery Belvedere in Austria. So, in 1945, after World War II ends, Ferdinand rewrote his own personal will, saying that he wanted his estate to go to his nieces and nephews because the Bloch-Bauers had never had children. Now, he wasn't thinking about the paintings and the Klimts because those were already lost to him. And in fact, in 1946, there was what was called the Annulment Act, which actually voided Nazi transactions. But the Bloch-Bauers were basically forced to relinquish most of their art collection to the Austrian state, presumably because of what Adele's will had said. So from the 1930s on, the Bloch-Bauer family was not in possession of this artwork. But then in 1998, there was what was called the Art Restitution Act, and this case came up again because it was seen as sort of like a double unfairness, because the family had lost the art first to the Nazis and then they lost it to the Austrian government, who didn't return the works. So ultimately, a woman named Maria Altmann, who was the niece of Adele and Ferdinand, and so she was the heir at this point to the estate, ended up suing the Austrian government in a United States court, and she ended up winning. And so she got her pictures back, and then she sold the portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer. It went up for sale at auction, and it was bought by Ronald Lauder for $135 million for this picture, which at that time was a record. I think it edged out a Picasso painting. It is no longer the record, but it's one of the most expensive paintings ever sold. Who would have thought it? Um, and in any case, that was in 2006, and now you can find it in the Neue Gallery, which is where the Lauder collection is. And of course, Klimt's most famous work, which was painted right at the same time as the Adele Bloch-Bauer, and it was also part of his golden period, is his famous picture called The Kiss. And he made numerous versions of this particular work, but this, of course, is the most canonical and famous. And when he exhibited it in 1908, it was such a success. And even though it is an erotic picture, that is disguised enough that it was ended up to be purchased by the Viennese state, and it's in the Gallery Belvedere. So the picture is of a couple locked in this embrace so that their bodies sort of merge. She's in a kneeling position, almost on the edge of this cliff, and he leans down over her. Once again, it's got the style that we saw with the Bloch-Bauer, with oil paint used for a more realistic treatment of the heads and the hands. And we also see her feet and her naked shoulder. But then the rest of the picture is all covered with gold, and gold dealt with in many different ways, from the geometricized patterns on their garments, so they're sort of enveloped in these robes, though we can still make out the outline of her body, to the gold spattered flowered carpet of the landscape, and then in the background, this sort of spattering surface like we saw behind the Adele Bloch-Bauer, which gives the background this sense of infinity. Now, though we're supposed to see these two bodies sort of enveloped and as one, they're also treated a little bit different, and you can see the different kinds of patterns on the body. His garment, which is dominated by black and gray and white rectangles, and hers, which have these brighter reds, purples, and blues, circular and curvilinear forms. And we can relate that to sort of the old-fashioned idea of the male as being more rational and that being expressed by these straight forms versus the female being more emotional, where we see all of these curved shapes and circles. But it is all about this tremendous sense of motion, and yet the figures are also somewhat still, and it makes it look almost like we're looking at either some sort of an altarpiece, sort of like they're wrapped in this halo. So it has that divine aspect to it. It was, though, erotic, and people have talked about whether or not the entire form of the two bodies together is phallic, or if that's particularly true of the sort of very thickened neck that we see on the exposed male figure. So this was really one of Klimt's most genius works, and he survives for about another 10 years after this, and he dies at the time of the great pandemic of the Spanish flu. So for the rest of lecture today, we're going to talk about the artists who we put under the larger umbrella of symbolism, which honestly is a very tricky period to define. It is loosely associated with a literary movement from around the same time. In 1886, the literary movement put out their Symbolist Manifesto, and they said, "In this art, the pictures of nature, the actions of human beings, all concrete phenomena would not themselves know how to manifest themselves. These are presented as the sensitive appearance destined to represent their esoteric affinity with primordial ideas." So the artists that we put into this group are pretty varied, and sometimes actually go back and include Van Gogh and Gauguin. In fact, Gauguin's picture of Jacob wrestling the angel is very often discussed as a symbolist work of art, while other people group them with the post-impressionists, which is where I've put them. But it's important to think of them this way, that it is essentially anti realism and anti-impressionism and anti-science. So there's this idea that, science, there have all been all these scientific revolutions and that everything has a rational explanation. And then that leads to the sort of diminishment of mysteries and unknown things in nature. So even think about the post-impressionists in the category of Cézanne and Seurat, who reduced color to science. So the symbolists instead were against this idea, and they wanted to go back to the idea of the spiritual rather than the material. So it was far less about painting what was seen in the natural world. So there's going to be an interest in intuition, in the subconscious, and in imagination rather than science and logic. So we're going to look at a few artists and you're going to see just how disparate they are. And to highlight just how different they are, in 1891, there was a poet and critic named Albert Aurier, and he tried to come up with what the 5 basic rules of symbolism were. And he called for 1, moral intelligence, 2, what he called symbolicalness, 3, subjectivity, 4, synthetic quality, and 5, decorativeness. So we can keep those things in mind as we look at our artists now. The first artist we're going to look at is an artist named Gustave Moreau, who was really considered to be among the greatest of the French symbolist painters. He was classically trained. His father was an architect. He went to boarding school where he was being educated when he was 11, but he came home 3 years later after the death of his younger sister, and he started to become educated at home. He studied things like classical literature. He read ancient Roman literature. He read Ovid. He learned about the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the Middle and Far East. He read from Shakespeare and the Bible. So this broad-ranging education. He ended up entering into art school. He traveled to Italy, where he studied after the Renaissance masters. And he eventually quit art school, though, after his second attempt to win the Rome Prize, which was one of sort of the great honors for young painters. He is, in a sense, more traditional. He exhibits at the Salon, he wins awards, but his idea was that even though some of his aesthetic ideas, as you're going to see, are quite traditional, he wanted to create a new kind of history painting. So we're going to see his relationship to the art of the past, but he was looking to create what he called, so what he said was an epic art that was not academic. So he's going to think a little bit like a history painter, but he's going to move us in a very different theatrical direction. He did travel in the circles of some of the artists we've met, especially Degas. And Degas had this wonderful description of him. He described him as a hermit who knows what times the trains leave, which is a very interesting idea. He lived very quietly by himself. He had an income where he could afford to, maintain his lifestyle. He stayed in his family home. He painted obsessively. He sold art very selectively. And ultimately, this family home, which becomes his studio, he gives to France when he dies to set up what was called the Musée Gustave Moreau, which opened up in 1903. So he actually creates his own museum, which has increasingly gotten more and more attention over modern times as his art has sort of been reinvigorated. There's a new attention that's been given to Moreau. Now, this is an example of one of Moreau's most famous works, and it's at the Metropolitan Museum, which is called Oedipus and the Sphinx from 1864. And he actually exhibits this at the Salon of 1864, where it got a lot of attention, though it was pretty harshly criticized. People didn't particularly care for its style, which they thought was sort of very sort of stiff and what they called archaic, sort of old-fashioned. But he showed this after about 9 years of not exhibiting at the Salon. So this was sort of his big triumphant return. The subject, as was very common for Moreau, comes from literature and mythology. In this case, it's the story of the Sphinx. And the Sphinx was this monstrous winged creature who had the breasts and the head of a woman, and she besieged the city of Thebes and basically devoured anybody who could not answer her riddle. And so you get the young Prince Oedipus who comes to confront her, and he gets her riddle. And the riddle was, what creature walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening? And the answer, of course, is a human, which crawls as a baby, walks on 2 legs as an adult, and in the twilight or evening of their life uses a cane, hence the 3rd leg. Um, you can see, by the way, a foot in the foreground and an oddly clinging hand onto a rock, presumably about to fall to his death, which were other travelers who failed to answer the Sphinx's riddle. And ultimately, when Oedipus answers her riddle, it will lead to her death, the Sphinx's death, and he'll go on to be made the king of Thebes. Um, this was a work that Moreau worked on for quite some time. He made at least 30 different sketches and 2 large cartoons, which were full-scale preparatory drawings made in preparation for a painted work. And he actually also made several painted versions of this picture in both oils and watercolors. So like some of the other artists we've seen, he tended to repeat and reuse some of his compositions. When he made this, he was looking at earlier academic art. It is sort of very idealized, and the encounter between the Sphinx and Oedipus is made both physical, though oddly separate, because you could see there's the weird placement of the drapery on his body, so it's not an intimate, sort of touching between them, but it's also made to be psychological, as we see the two figures sort of peering into each other's eyes. It is also a highly, I mean, this is symbolism. It is a highly symbolist work, symbolicalness. What was that word that we heard? There's a lot of what we call iconography or symbols being used in this particular work. We could see those more clearly if we zoom in, but you can see a whole variety of symbols being used by the artist. You could see, for example, the paired trees. There's one behind the figure of Oedipus, which is actually a laurel tree, which is usually considered to be a symbol of man's achievement. We'll see great thinkers and poets sometimes with crowns of laurel leaves on their head. And on the other side, on the side with the Sphinx, we can see a fig tree, which traditionally was associated with temptation. There are other objects here that are symbols as well. If we look down in the foreground, which is why I blew this up, you can see both a golden crown, which is a symbol of political power, as well as golden laurel, which is often a symbol of academic honors and learning. And there's the jewelry we actually see on the Sphinx, which is a symbol of material wealth. So all of those things may be symbols of worldly temptations, which we're going to have to see then Oedipus sort of resisting. So even though this picture is about a riddle, it's ultimately about him resisting temptation. There's also this very unusual stand behind with an urn on top, standing behind Oedipus. There's a snake coiled around the stand, around this column, which might be a symbol of death, and obviously it's traditionally a symbol of evil, as in the Garden of Eden, and of temptation and sin. While at the top, and it's a little hard to make out in this picture, but right here at the top over the urn, there's a butterfly, which might be a symbol of good or a symbol of the soul. And so that might be meant to suggest good versus evil, or the soul versus death. In any case, the symbols can be read in many different ways, which makes the picture mysterious and enigmatic, which is one of the things that Moreau liked in his works. Another one of Moreau's most famous work is a picture called The Apparition from 1876. He makes many versions of this picture. This one took him 7 years to paint, and you could see that he's built up the surface of the paint. It's very sort of thick and almost encrusted in its style. He exhibits it at the Salon in 1876 once he finishes it, where it caused quite a sensation. Mostly the publics and the critics liked the work, and then he showed it 2 years later in 1878 at the Universal Exposition. Um, as I said, the critics generally liked it, though some of them said that it was a result of the use of opium. The picture itself is a biblical subject, and Moreau tends to like subjects from literature and from the Bible. And this is a scene that shows Salome, who was the stepdaughter of King Herod, who is bewitching him with her dance. And as a reward, she gets her wish, which was for the head of St. John the Baptist. So we can actually see several people in this work. We see the dancing Salome. We can see Herod on his throne with his wife beside him. We could see a musician towards the central axis of the work, and off to the right-hand side, we can see the executioner with his sword. And so the picture is actually, as we saw with Oedipus and the Sphinx, it's quite unclear as to what its meaning is. She sort of stops in her dance in this incredibly impossible gravity-defying pose. You could see she's on like the tippy tops of her toes. And she points in the air and gazes towards this hovering apparition of the decapitated, severed head of St. John the Baptist. So is this her having a vision? Is she imagining what she wants? Or is it the sort of mystical execution of St. John the Baptist at that moment? So there's this wonderful gory image of the head in a nimbus, and it's probably only at that moment seen by Salome. You can see the gaze is quite important, and Herod does not look towards it. This setting is in this wonderful, fantastic palace, and you can see it's all very erotic and exotic. She's covered with jewelry and rich fabrics, and this is set into like the setting is pulling together references from all different places in time, disparate Western and Eastern civilizations. So there's references to the Great Mosque at Cordoba and the Spanish Alhambra, so Islamic architecture. There's references to French cathedrals and Indian temples and classical architecture, and it's all mashed together, which makes it really appear like this is happening in undefined time and in an undefined place. So once again, we're dealing with a work that was full of mystery. Now, we've seen the subject of the dance before, and so it's interesting to think of Moreau along with Degas, and they were actually friends, even though ultimately they drift apart because their styles are just so wildly different. Degas was really interested in things that were momentary and temporal and contemporary and naturalistic in a sense of their subject, whereas for Moreau, he was interested in things that were timeless and frozen, and he really was, as we say, sort of traditional, and he believed in that notion of the hierarchy of subjects that was propagated by the Academy. So the idea that subjects from literature or the Bible were more important than subjects from contemporary life. So we go from the transient to the timeless, from the everyday to mythology. So even though they share some things in common, the ultimate things they produce are worlds apart. And there's a great interaction between the two that was recorded when Moreau said to Degas, "So do you think you can restore art through dance?" And Degas says to Moreau, "And you? Do you think you can renew it with jewelry?" And so a reference to his incredibly ornate style. A somewhat lesser known artist is the Frenchman Odilon Redon, who not that much is known about, and it's said that maybe even less is understood. He was the son of a Creole mother and a Frenchman who actually meet in the United States in Louisiana, though Redon is born back in France, actually in Bordeaux. It's said that he had a very troubled childhood, where that he was neglected by his parents, that he was lonely, that he was plagued by illness, and he later wrote about being haunted by imaginary things. And so we sense that from an early age he was very interested in sort of his inner world and his inner life. From the time of his first communion, he became interested in looking at Gothic cathedrals and stained glass, precisely those kind of things that we saw interest other artists of the Art Nouveau and of symbolism, sort of looking towards the older arts. He studied architecture originally at the Beaux-Arts, but he ended up failing out and he failed his exams. Ultimately, he becomes an artist who primarily works in two dimensions, but he does different things. He's a painter, he's a graphic artist, he does many, many drawings in charcoal, and he becomes a printmaker, working both in etching and in lithography. Even though he is, as you see, a pretty eccentric artist, he's an active participant in the art world around him. He knew Courbet. He certainly knew of the works of artists like Moreau. But by 1867, he's participating in the Salon, but as a printmaker. He actually helped to organize the Salon des Independents in 1884 and eventually became its president. And he did actually submit works to the eighth and final Impressionist exhibition in 1886. Now I'm starting here not because I have a terrible lot of information to give you about these works, but to show you what a sort of eccentric and interesting artist Redon was. Now this is him working in more of a graphic mode. So I'm showing you a charcoal drawing on paper on the left and a lithograph on the right. And we've learned about lithography, which is something that Redon was introduced to and began to experiment with by the 1870s. On the right-hand side is Redon's The Egg, which was actually part of a series of prints. Well, it was originally supposed to be part of a series of prints that were called the Homage to Goya. Goya was Don Francisco Goya, the romantic Spanish painter and printmaker of the late 18th and early 19th century, with whom Redon was clearly enamored. And he, too, was very eccentric with fantastic images of things like witches and monsters, clearly things that attracted Redon. So he made a series of prints dedicated to the memory of Goya. This was made for that series, but ultimately was not included in it. But I included it because I found it particularly interesting and quirky. And then you can see the drawing of Cactus Man on the left. Both of these together show you the way in which Redon is working, which is to say he begins by combining disparate ideas and anthropomorphic and inanimate objects and sort of morphing these things together. So we get the sort of surprised egg who's probably about to be eaten. And on the left-hand side, we get this humanoid version of a cactus coming out of a planting pot. The cactus image is also interesting because you can see Redon referring to other old-fashioned iconography. In this case, probably something like Christ and the crown of thorns, like the mocking of Christ, or you get the tortured Christ. Here where the spikes on the cactus become like the crown of thorns, and we get the sort of suffering image of Cactus Man, which is something the symbolists were interested in, the mocking of Christ sort of image, because it became sort of like a reference of the tortured artist, the suffering artist. So I think these two works give you a sense of Redon's personality when he's working in the sort of graphic mode without color. And this is one of Redon's most famous paintings. And it shows in a way that he's thinking a lot like Gustave Moreau does, a sort of fellow symbolist. in that he's looking towards literature. So a lot of Redon's topics have their roots in literature, in this case in ancient Greek mythology. So the story here is actually taken from Homer's Odyssey, and it had to do with the giant Polyphemus, who ultimately has to be defeated by the hero Odysseus. But this is from a different part of the story where Polyphemus, this Cyclops, and here you can see he's a one-eyed giant, who falls in love with the nymph Galatea. But it's an unrequited love because she's in love with Achis, who ultimately Polyphemus kills by hurling a boulder at him. Perhaps he's also drawn to this topic because Cyclops and giants were also really popular in things like French folk tales. And throughout Redon's work, we see the repeated motif of a Cyclops or a single eye sort of on either a plant or a balloon, things like this. So this is actually, you can see the sort of balloon-like form with this enormous eye emerging out from behind this rocky this outcropping of rock to spy on the nymph Galatea, who's laying in this patch of foliage. Quite interesting. When we look at Redon in the graphic arts, his work looks quite dark. But when we see him as a painter, you can see his relationship to the art of the Impressionists. He's got this very sort of stippled brushwork effect. You can very clearly see all the brushwork here with these unblended colors taken right from the tube. He works with a very open palette, meaning we see every color of the spectrum here, again, separately arranged on different parts of the canvas as opposed to being blended on the surface. It's not light and dark, it's all pure color thickly applied. So it's as if he's using the Impressionist palette and the Impressionist brushwork, but doing it for a very different purpose, because once again, his interest is to tell stories and to relate to works of literature. Even though we've been looking at the French symbolists, one of the most famous and well-known now artists of the period is Edvard Munch, the Norwegian artist. He grew up in the Norwegian capital, which was Christiania. It's now Oslo. He trained in the Royal College of Art and Design there, first studying sculpture, then painting. And eventually, when he was in his early 20s, he got a scholarship from the Norwegian government to go to Paris. And actually, for much of his career, he moved between Norway and France and Germany until about 1908 when he suffered a breakdown. And from then until the end of his life in 1944, he really traveled very little and he limited himself to Norway. He had a very productive career, about 1,700 paintings, which is a large number, plus a bunch of sketches and drawings, and more than 800 prints, including some woodcuts. For Munch, we talk about the work as being subjective for the symbolists, and really he was very much impacted by the work he made, and he expressed a lot about his personal life in his work. So we tend to talk a lot about Munch's personal life, which was very much affected by tragedies he suffered as a child. His mother died from tuberculosis when Munch was 5 years old, and his sister died when he was 15. His father was a doctor, but was also like fervently religious and very much didn't like Munch's association with some of the sort of radical intellectuals he hung out with. Munch, over the course of his life, suffered from a variety of conditions, including agoraphobia. He suffered bouts of paranoia and neurotic sickness and drunkenness, abusing alcohol for large periods of his career. By the time we get to about 1916, he basically lives like a hermit until his death. Interestingly, in 1937, while Munch was still alive, his works were seized by the German museums and they were labeled by the Nazis as degenerate art. So he has a very interesting career and one that is very much bound, as you're going to see, with his personal life. A really good example of the way that Munch's life is completely bound up with his art is this early work, which is kind of seen as like this breakthrough moment for Munch as a still pretty early artist. This is something he's painting when he's in his 20s. Um, the subject of the picture was actually his sister Sophie, who died when he was 15 from tubercular consumption. He exhibited this work publicly at the Autumn Exhibition in Christiana in 1886, but it's very interesting. He exhibits it under the title The Sketch, which is a really odd, purposefully non-autobiographical kind of subject. It was very badly panned by the critics, who said that he couldn't paint. They said he painted like a swine. They particularly criticized the way that he painted hands. But for Munch, regardless of how he originally titled the work, this was a really personal thing, and this was him still dealing and coming to grips with the loss of his sister. And in fact, he worked not only on this canvas, and he overworks the canvas. So the canvas, the surface is super thick, like him applying paint and scraping it off and working it on so that the paint is sort of three-dimensional. It's not just brushed on anymore. That too is probably a way of him working out his grief in paint. And he ends up painting this composition quite a few times. It's something he refers to over and over again. And yet, though it's about the loss of his sister, it's not sentimental. Munch talked about death, and when he said that when we die, it's the world that dies from us. So the picture is really not about the dying or the sick child, it's about the grieving mother. You can almost sense that Sophie in this picture is already halfway to another place. There's this bright light shining on her face, and right in the center of the canvas, if you draw an X through the canvas, you see his mother's hands tied up with those of Sophie, or this mother's hands. That's interesting because Sophie's mother was gone. But you see this mother and child, and their hands bound together, frozen, melded together. You can't even separate them in the middle of the canvas. It was said that he painted clumsily, but interestingly, the stuff that he doesn't paint with a lot of care are those things that are earthly, and that's not what this picture is about. So things like the table or chair in the foreground, or the curtains, or the glass, but these are all things that are not the subject of the work. It's about something transcendental and something else. But the picture ultimately wasn't, as I said, sentimental, and it didn't give the viewer this sense of comfort that they would look for in a subject of this type, which really is supposed to pull at the heartstrings. And of course, you all know Munch, even if you don't know you know Munch, because pretty much everybody knows the Scream, which is one of the most famous and often reproduced works of all time, which originally he had titled Despair. But it is this example of a very symbolist idea of using the natural world to express something. Think of Van Gogh using the landscape to express his own state of despair and his thoughts of suicide. Well, so here we see Munch using the landscape to show the psychological state of the person that we're looking at here in the foreground. We think this is related to a diary entry that he wrote down the year before. So in 1892, he wrote in his diary about an experience and a feeling he had. And he said this: "I was walking along the road with two friends. The sun began to set. I felt a tinge of melancholy. Suddenly the sky became blood red. I stopped, leaning over the railing, dead tired, and I looked at the flaming clouds that hung like blood and soared over the blue-black fjord and the city. My friends walked on. I stood there, trembling with fright, and I felt a loud, unending scream piercing nature." And he had talked to his friend about then wanting to paint this memory he had of a landscape of the sunset that looked like coagulated blood. And so we see what he describes: a figure standing on the bridge, next to the railing and screaming with his hands covering his ears. And you can see this primal scream and the way that the landscape sort of reverberates and echoes out from that scream. We talk about the fact that Munch experienced sort of anxiety and agoraphobia and had a breakdown. And so we feel some of that in here. In other words, there's almost this sense that he's got this fear of these open spaces, and those two friends of his become ominous forms in the background. But here what's interesting is that he's using these bright unmodulated colors, he's using these curvilinear forms, and he's doing it all to expressive end. The same with the distortion of the figure who becomes boneless, and his body curves the way the landscape and the water curves, the way those curves then meld into the sky with the sunset. And the figure becomes this sort of skull-like treatment, which again goes to express some of the horror of the scene. Another way he does that is by exaggerating the perspective. So these lines of perspective that shoot into the background create this sense, again, of motion and a sense of instability in the work. So it's another interesting idea. And again, you could see how we put him with the symbolists, because here he's painting this landscape, but it's about way more than its superficial appearance. It really is about the inner life of the figure that we see. Like many of the compositions that were really important to Munch, he revisited it throughout his life. And you can see here the at least 4 painted versions we have, along with a version that's purely lithograph, which is interesting because so much of the expressive power of the picture seems at first glance to be about color and the dissonance in the color. But when you see it reduced to all line, you see how powerful things like the swirls of the landscape and the thrusting perspective of the bridge really are to the work. You could see the color stripped away. You also can see that the brushwork he's using is not the same as Van Gogh's brushwork, even though it too is about the expressive power of landscape. But here, it's not those little inch-long stitch kind of like strokes. It's these big, long, swirling strokes that move their way about the canvas. The work on the top right on your screen right now is one of the later versions of the screen. That's from around 1910. That work was famously stolen from a museum in Oslo in 2004, like stolen at gunpoint in the middle of the night. That's when people figured out that you could rob museums at gunpoint, because like most of the people, even the museum staff, isn't going to fight back. That picture went disappear. It disappeared. It went missing for 2 years, but it was finally recovered in 2006. It was damaged, but has since been repaired. So in his notebooks, Munch made these notations, and sometimes they're quite interesting. And at one point he wrote, "No longer should you paint interiors with men reading and women knitting. These must be human beings who breathe and feel and love and suffer. I would paint such pictures in a cycle. People would understand the sacredness of them and take their hats off as if in a church." Now, interestingly, Munch, a lot of his pictures from the 1890s, he seemed to intend to pull together into a larger cycle. What he talks about there, which he called the frieze of life, that included the painting of the scream. And it really was about the sort of tragedy and suffering of humanity. And this is one of the pictures that was meant to be part of the frieze of life. And by frieze, we mean like a long narrative band, a sort of horizontal band of pictures. But they were all separate works that he just imagined as part of this life cycle that told the story of the tragedy of man's existence. And this was part of it, which was called the Dance of Life. And he painted 3 versions of this. Again, so that's Munch for you. He comes back to these scenes over and over again. And here we see the idea of the dance as a metaphor for life and a metaphor for love. And you get the sense when you look at Munch that this is not sort of the happy ending in the scene. So we see pictures. A picture, it's a frieze, so we can sort of read it from left to right. But leaving that aside for a second, the central scene seems to be what is intended as a self-portrait image of Munch. who is dancing with his first love, who is a woman named Millie, right, which is the woman in the red dress that sort of envelops the man. But the two women on the outer side, that are balanced out in the white dress and the black dress, is the same model used twice, and her name was Tula. It appears as if we're supposed to be able to read the work from left to right. So you see, um, as Monk described it, the awakening of love, the dance of life, love at its peak, the fading of love, and eventually death. So this appears to be what we see here. So we see that same model, Tula, on the left and on the right. On the left-hand side, she is, glowy and virginal in her white dress, reaching out for this flower. In the middle picture, we see Monk and Millie dancing, and she's wearing this red dress, which seems to suggest she's sort of this temptress, and it's a color that's associated with passion. And then on the right hand side, we see this very sort of sober, um, sort of greenish, you look at the color of her hands, cadaverous figure that's dressed in black with her hands sort of clasped together as if there is this sense of resignation. Even the couple we see right beside her who are dancing, we see the woman pull away. So again, suggesting that this is very different than the joyous couple dancing in the background on the left-hand side. So it really becomes about expectations of love and then the loss of that love, and ultimately about the loss of life. The forms are all very, very simplified. We've got these flat areas of unmodulated color, almost a sketch-like quality, a very visible brushstroke. And I'm always struck by the detail of that glowing landscape in the background, that purplish pinkish landscape with the moon reflecting off of the water, and you could see how simplified that forma is. And that reflection of the moonlight on the water has been related to something phallic. It's also been related to a crucifixion. I always see a lowercase I, but you get a sense of just how two-dimensional Monk style is. And the last artist I want to show you, I'm just going to show you a single picture by, although I'm telling you it does not do him justice, but it is his most magnificent and famous work, which is the Belgian painter James Ensor. So he was an artist who definitely spent years with formal training. He spent 3 years studying history painting and religious painting at the Academy in Brussels. And he was an artist who worked like Munch in various two-dimensional media. So he worked as a painter and as a printmaker and also as a draftsman. But he is seen as quite an eccentric type. Um, and he really, well, early on in his career, he sort of has a very important role in his 20s in the foundation and the leadership of a group of artists that was called the 20. They were avant-garde artists, and this whole idea is they wanted to promote new ideas and new artistic developments. And so he had to do with the founding of this group of the 20, and he becomes the leader of it, but ultimately he ends up having a lot of conflict with the other members of the group. And by the 1890s, he's having like a whole bunch of personal crises. He's got this ulcer he develops. He's fighting with his family because they forbade him to marry the woman that he was in love with. And at one point in the 1890s, he sells all of the stuff in his studio and like gives up painting. But by the time we get a little bit later, he picks up painting again. And in the new century, in the 20th century, early on, he actually achieved a tremendous amount of success. He has public acclaim, he was actually knighted, and he has a very long career because he works all the way until 1949, and he dies at 89 years old, and he paints pretty much the whole time. But other than that, he was eccentric. He apparently did not very often leave the attic of his family home, which was on this small seaside resort town. The family had a house and a souvenir shop, and he was sort of isolated, eccentric type. And I'll show you what is considered his real masterwork. Now, by far, Enzer's most famous work, and an impressively huge work, was Christ's entry into Brussels in 1889. And even though this is his most famous work, he painted it when he was 28 years old, so it's a pretty early work for him. He intended it to be for the 1889 exhibition of the 20, but it was actually too much for them. They refused to let him show the work, and so this was actually never seen publicly until 1929. So it's a pretty revolutionary work that wasn't seen for 40 years. And in fact, as a result, he actually saved himself from being expelled from the group by just about one vote. So we know, and I already talked about the fact that Ensor studied religious painting and history painting when he was at the Brussels Academy, and this is a religious painting subject done in a really interesting way. He gets interested in scenes of the torment of Christ, and in this case he's painting what should have been Christ's entry into Jerusalem. And that's usually the events of Palm Sunday, and it begins the week of the Passion, which are the events leading up to Christ's death. Here, Ensor has taken the subject and he's retold it in terms of the modern city. So instead of entering Jerusalem, he's entering Brussels. And instead of it being in the 1st century AD, it is 1889. Now, the fact that he does this shows that Ensor's actually really aware of history and of the history of painting. Because we could think of the painting as being loosely based on works by another Netherlandish painter, which was Peter Bruegel the Elder. And in the 16th century, Bruegel painted what was a pretty revolutionary picture, which was a scene of the procession to Calvary, meaning this is the event where Christ is carrying the cross to Calvary, which was the place of the crucifixion. And he does it in a really similar way because we are in this picture not in Jerusalem either. In Bruegel's picture, we're supposed to understand that we're in the Netherlands, and we can see here a windmill, for example, on top of this rock. And even though this scene is supposed to show Christ carrying the cross, he's hard to find in the picture. He's very much in the middle of the picture. He's right there. Right in the dead center, if you draw an X through the picture, is where Christ is. But he's surrounded by all of these contemporary people going on about their lives. And that's something very similar to what Ensor does. Now again, this is a scene of Christ's entry, but it is placed in downtown Brussels, where we see the street filled with a carnival procession with marching bands and masked revelers. Masks were a motif that Ensor was really, really interested in. His parents, I mentioned that they had a souvenir shop at this place called Ostend, and they included carnival masks, and then so this becomes something that Ensor uses a lot in his works. Masks are a fascinating thing. They protect us, they hide our identity, and they're also threatening because of that. And Ensor generally used them as a negative. He described them as suffering, scandalized, insolent, cruel, and malicious masks. So here we can see this sort of carnival celebration, right? Which is carnival is the season that precedes Lent, but it really is supposed to represent the stupidity and the inhumanity and the indifference and the evil of the modern world. The color that he paints is very sort of shocking, far more shocking than Impressionist colors as well. Now, we say that this is a scene of Christ. It can be hard to make him out, but we could see him positioned kind of like how he was in Bruegel's, very much in the distance, coming in the center behind the marching band. But in the background, we can see teeming masses of humanity all the way in the back. In the foreground, we see people leading the marching band, but we also see all of these masked revelers, including this very prominent death head, which again shows the sort of sense of evil in the scene. And just like in Bruegel's picture, Christ is dwarfed amidst the modern city. And that too suggests some sort of critique of modern life. Now, just as an idea, You can see the image here of Christ on the horse. It's supposed to be a self-portrait, or on a donkey. It's supposed to be a self-portrait likeness of Ensor, so he includes himself in the work, and he also includes a critique of the 20, the group that actually then had rejected this work for exhibition. You could see on this balcony, which is just under the banner, which I'll just show you, towards the left-hand side of this enormous banner, there's a green balcony with the sign of the 20 on it, the two X's, and you could see one figure vomiting over the railing and the other one defecating, which seems to show his dissatisfaction with the organization with which he had been involved. And just to pull back and look at the full view one last time, though this is the kind of work you really can get absorbed in. Here you could see that detail that I just showed you under the banner, right here under the word vive. And here you could see a large red banner across the top, which basically says, "Long live the social." And it seems to be a reference to socialist and workers' movements which were popular at the time, and it appears as if Ensor lampoons everybody, from the socialist workers to the bourgeoisie, all mixed into this grotesque carnival atmosphere. And so that is where I'm going to stop our discussion of Art Nouveau and symbolism. It's been a little bit of a crazy week because, as you saw, these were not very cohesive groups that are really only loosely organized around ideas. Things will change a little bit when we move on to our next unit. So I'll see you next week.